I've always been the kind of person who likes to be out there, deep in the woods where you don't hear cars, where you don't see another soul for miles. I don't go with groups. I don't go to campgrounds with picnic tables and bathrooms. I go to be alone. I go to disconnect. I never thought twice about it. It was just part of who I was. This trip was supposed to be like any other. I picked a spot up north, near the edge of a national forest where the trees are tall and packed so close together that even in daylight it feels like dusk. I'd been there before. It was good land, thick pines, clean water, plenty of deer. Quiet. I left on a Thursday morning. The drive took about 3 hours and I spent another 3 hiking in. The trail was rough, more like a deer path than anything official, but that's how I like it. The harder it is to get there, the better. It was mid-October, cold enough that the bugs were gone, but not cold enough to worry about freezing at night. The air smelled sharp and earthy, with that dampness you only get in the fall. By the time I got to the spot, it was late afternoon. I pitched my tent just off the tree line where the ground was flat. The clearing wasn't big, maybe 30 yards across, surrounded on all sides by thick pines, the kind of trees that block out most of the light, even at noon. A creek ran along the edge, shallow and slow, but enough to fill a canteen. It was perfect. I spent the rest of the daylight gathering wood and setting up camp. The quiet out there is different from anywhere else. It's so still that you notice every little thing, the crack of a branch, the way the wind makes the trees creak. I'm used to it. It's calming usually, but that night it didn't feel calm. I built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat there watching the flames until it got dark. The moon was bright enough that I didn't need my flashlight. The sky was clear, and the air was cold enough to bite, but not enough to make me uncomfortable. I stayed up later than I planned, just sitting there, listening to the woods. That's when I heard it. It wasn't footsteps at first. It was breathing deep, heavy breaths, slow and labored. It came from the trees, somewhere beyond the firelight. I thought maybe it was a deer or a bear sniffing the air. I stayed still, barely breathing. Then I heard the steps. They were heavy, too heavy for a deer. Slow, deliberate. I shined my flashlight toward the sound, but I couldn't see anything beyond the first few trees. The beam just disappeared into the dark. I waited, listening. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing, just the crackle of the fire and my own breathing. I told myself it was a bear. Maybe it caught my scent and got curious, but something about it felt off. Bears don't move like that. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, I hiked out a bit, trying to shake the feeling. The woods were quiet, colder than the day before. I didn't see any tracks, didn't hear anything out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake it. That feeling that something was watching me. I felt it before when I've run into predators, mountain lions, bears, but this was different. It wasn't just being watched. It felt personal. I got back to camp before sundown, rebuilt the fire, ate dinner. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was overthinking it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, the sounds started earlier. The breathing came first. Low, rumbling breaths that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air. I sat there listening. Then the steps. Slow, heavy. But this time they didn't stop. They circled the clearing, staying just out of sight. I followed the sound with the flashlight, but I never caught a glimpse of it. Just the sound, slow, methodical steps like it was pacing. And then something worse, the growl. It was low, deep enough that I felt it in my chest. I've heard wolves before. I've heard bears. This was neither. It didn't sound right. It sounded bigger, meaner, like it wasn't just hunting. It was angry. I threw more wood on the fire, the flames roaring high. I didn't sleep. I sat there until dawn, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. Nothing came out of the trees, but it never left. I could feel it. The next morning, I found the tracks. They were big, too big, like a wolf print, but twice the size. The claws dug deep into the dirt, like it was pressing down hard. I followed them for a few yards before they disappeared into the rocks. My chest felt tight. I've hunted my whole life. I know the animals in these woods. There's nothing that leaves prints like that. I packed up camp by noon. I was done. I told myself I was being smart, that whatever it wasn't worth messing with. But the truth was, I was scared. I'd never felt that way out there before. I didn't like it. The hike back to the truck was long. Too long. The woods felt darker than they should have been, even in daylight. I kept hearing things. Branches snapping, leaves crunching. Always just far enough behind me that I couldn't see what it was. I moved faster. When I was about a mile from the trailhead, I smelled it. Blood. It was thick in the air, sharp and metallic. I followed the smell without thinking, stepping off the trail and into the trees. That's when I found it. A deer, or what was left of it. It was torn apart. Not eaten, just shredded. The ribs were snapped open. The guts spilled across the ground. But what stuck with me the most was the way the head was facing, twisted all the way around. Something did that for fun. I didn't stick around to look at it. I got back on the trail and didn't stop until I reached the truck. I locked the doors as soon as I got inside, heart pounding, breath shaking. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I saw something standing at the tree line. Tall, broad, dark fur. But when I looked again, it was gone. I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was just a wolf. Maybe it was something else. All I know is that I haven't been back, and I don't think I ever will be. I never used to worry about being out in the woods alone. I grew up around it, camping, fishing, all that. I was used to the sounds, the cold, the dark. It always felt more like home than the city ever did. I wasn't one of those people who got jumpy when the sun went down. I knew the woods. I trusted them. At least I thought I did. It was late October when I decided to take a weekend trip out to Copper Ridge. There's a trail there that runs deep into the forest, way off the beaten path. I'd been out there a couple of times before, but never this late in the season. Most people were done camping by now, too cold at night, too unpredictable with the weather. But I liked that. The fewer people around, the better. I liked the quiet. I left on a Friday morning. The air was crisp, the sky pale and cloudy. The drive to the trailhead took about 2 hours. I parked, strapped on my pack, and started hiking. The trail cuts through miles of dense pine forest before opening up into a clearing near a small lake. That was where I planned to camp. It was a good spot, flat ground, plenty of wood for a fire, far enough from the trail that nobody would stumble across it by accident. I got there in the late afternoon, with enough daylight left to set up camp. I pitched my tent at the edge of the clearing, about 20 yards from the water. The lake was still, dark, and glassy. The sky hung low and gray. It was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that seeps in slow, where you don't notice it until your fingers start to go numb. I built a fire to warm up, made some food, and sat by the flames as the light faded. By nightfall, the woods were completely still. No wind, no birds, just the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of water lapping at the shore. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how calm, but there was something off. I didn't notice it at first. It was subtle, the way the air felt heavy, the way the shadows seemed a little darker than they should have been. I told myself it was nothing. I was just tired from the hike. I sat by the fire until around 11 p.m., then put it out and crawled into my tent. The cold hit me harder than I expected. I zipped my sleeping bag tight and pulled my beanie down over my ears. I laid there for a while, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the quiet. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but it wasn't. The steps were slow, heavy, too deliberate, not the skittish, darting movements of wildlife. This was different. I held my breath, heart pounding. The footsteps were coming from the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. They stopped. I waited, barely breathing. I could feel my pulse in my ears. For a long time, there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard it again, the faint crunch of leaves underfoot. This time, it circled to the other side of the clearing. Slowly, methodically, I told myself it had to be another camper. maybe a hunter passing through. But why wouldn't they have a light? Why wouldn't they say something? I thought about calling out, but something stopped me. A feeling in my gut, a primal instinct telling me to stay quiet. The footsteps kept circling, slow, steady, always just beyond the trees. I sat up in my sleeping bag, gripping the flashlight in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to let them know I was awake. Eventually, the steps faded. I sat there in the dark, heart pounding, waiting to hear them again, but it stayed quiet. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I got out of the tent and checked the clearing. Everything looked normal. No broken branches, no signs that anyone had been there. I walked to the edge of the trees where I thought I'd heard the footsteps. That's when I saw them. Tracks. They weren't boot prints. No tread, no shape. Just deep impressions in the dirt, long, narrow, almost like bare feet. But they were bigger than any footprints I'd ever seen. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I thought about packing up right then, but I convinced myself to stay. I didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was just some weirdo messing around. Maybe I was overthinking it. I spent most of the day hiking around the lake, trying to shake off the nerves. But that feeling stayed with me, that heavy, sinking feeling, like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was never anyone there. That night, the woods felt different. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was suffocating. I built a bigger fire this time, hoping the light would keep whatever it was away. I sat close to the flames, listening to the crackle of the wood, waiting for something to happen. It didn't take long. The footsteps started again around midnight. Slow, heavy. This time, they were closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing. Just darkness. I could feel my chest tightening, my hands shaking. And then I heard something worse. Breathing. It was faint, but it was there, low and steady. Not from an animal, from something big. It was coming from the trees, just beyond the light of the fire. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I just sat there, frozen, listening to the sound of something breathing in the dark. And then, silence. I sat by the fire until the sun came up, too scared to move. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed up my gear and left. I didn't even bother taking down the tent. I just grabbed what I could and started hiking. The whole way back to the truck, I kept expecting to hear those footsteps behind me. I kept looking over my shoulder, heart pounding, but there was never anyone there. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, I threw my pack in the truck and got out of there as fast as I could. I drove for an hour before I finally pulled over on the side of the road. I sat there with my hands on the wheel, shaking, trying to make sense of what happened. I still don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was just some guy messing around. Maybe it was something else. I don't know. All I know is that I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. I always thought I was the kind of person who could handle anything. I grew up outdoors, hunting, fishing, hiking, the kind of stuff that makes you feel like you're in control. I liked being alone out there. It felt like the one place where things made sense. No noise, no people, just me and the woods. I never thought the woods could turn on me, but they did. It happened last October. I had a long weekend off work, and I decided to head out to a spot I'd found a few years back, about 10 miles into the national forest. It wasn't a marked campsite, just a flat clearing near a creek with a good spot for a fire. Nobody ever went that far out, and that's why I liked it. I packed light. A small tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, food for a couple of days. I left early Friday morning, parked my truck at the trailhead, and started hiking. The weather was perfect, cold enough to keep the bugs away, but not so cold you couldn't enjoy it. The hike out there took about 3 hours. I didn't see a single person on the way, which was fine by me. The woods were quiet, except for the wind in the trees and the crunch of leaves under my boots. I got to the clearing around mid-afternoon, pitched my tent near the tree line, gathered some firewood, and settled in. The first night was normal. I built a fire, cooked some food, and sat there watching the flames until it got late. It was one of those calm, Still nights where the air feels heavy, but not in a bad way, just quiet. I crawled into my tent a little after midnight and fell asleep almost right away. I woke up to the sound of movement. At first, I thought it was an animal. I'm used to hearing things walking around at night. Raccoons, deer, sometimes a bear if you're unlucky. But this was different. The steps were slow, heavy, and spaced out. Not the quick rustling of a four-legged animal. It sounded like a person. I laid there, perfectly still, barely breathing. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. I listened, trying to track where the sound was coming from. It was close, maybe 30 or 40 yards out, just beyond the tree line. I glanced at my watch. 3:12 a.m. The fire outside was down to embers, barely putting out any light. The footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like forever, straining my ears. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination. The woods mess with your head sometimes. You hear one noise, and suddenly you're convinced someone's out there. I forced myself to relax. After a while, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I got up and looked around the campsite. There was nothing out of place, no tracks, no broken branches. I figured it must have been an animal after all. I shook it off and spent the day fishing down by the creek. I caught a couple of trout, cooked one for lunch, and saved the other for dinner. By the time the sun started to set, I was feeling better. I had convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. But that night, the feeling came back. It started the same way, slow, steady footsteps in the distance. This time, they came from the opposite side of the clearing. I was sitting by the fire when I heard it. I froze, holding my breath, straining to see into the dark. The footsteps were deliberate. No crashing through the woods. No stopping to sniff the air like an animal would. Just slow, steady steps like someone taking their time. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness. I called out. Not yelling, just loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. No response. The footsteps stopped. I sat there for a long time, heart pounding, waiting to hear them again. But it stayed quiet. I told myself it was nothing. I even laughed a little, trying to shake off the nerves. I added more wood to the fire and sat there until the flames were high again. But I couldn't relax. I kept thinking about those footsteps, about how they circled the clearing, just far enough out that I couldn't see who or what was making them. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I was tired, really tired. I packed up my gear, thinking about heading back early. But part of me didn't want to leave. I felt stupid for being scared. I'd spent years camping alone. I'd never had a problem before. Why now? I told myself I was overreacting. I decided to stay one more night. That was a mistake. It started raining around sunset. Just a light drizzle at first, but by nightfall it was coming down hard. I sat in my tent, listening to the rain hit the fabric, hoping it would drown out the sounds from the night before. But it didn't. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time they were closer, much closer. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my hands shaking as I reached for my flashlight. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and shined the light out into the rain. The fire had gone out. The clearing was dark, but I could just make out the shape of the trees. I listened. The footsteps were circling my tent. Slow, deliberate, closer than before. I shined the flashlight toward the sound, but the rain made it hard to see. I couldn't make anything out. I wanted to call out, to say something, anything, but my throat felt tight. I could barely breathe. And then the footsteps stopped. I sat there, shaking, shining the light into the dark. I waited for something to move, for someone to say something, but there was nothing, just the sound of the rain. That was it for me. I packed up what I could in the dark, just the essentials. I left the tent, left most of my gear. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I started hiking back toward the trailhead, my flashlight cutting through the rain. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing. I made it back to my truck just after sunrise. I was soaked, exhausted, and shaking so bad I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I didn't stop driving until I was back home, hours later. I still don't know who or what was out there. I never went back for my tent, never reported it. What would I even say? That I heard footsteps in the woods? That I felt like someone was watching me? It's been months now, and I still think about it. Every time I close my eyes, I hear those footsteps. Slow, steady, circling. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. I've never been the kind of person who gets scared easily. I've spent most of my life outdoors, camping, hiking, fishing. I've been through storms that rattled the ground, had black bears wander too close for comfort, even got lost once or twice. None of that ever really shook me, but there's something about silence that sticks with you. When it's so quiet that your own breathing feels too loud, that's when things get weird. That's when you start to notice everything. Every creak, every rustle, every shadow moving just a little too much. It was late September when I decided to head out for a weekend camping trip by myself. I'd done solo trips before. I actually preferred them. No small talk, no waiting for anyone to catch up on the trail. Just me, the trees, and the sound of my boots on the dirt. The plan was simple. Hike about 6 miles out to a spot I'd camped at a few times before, set up for the weekend, then head back Sunday morning. The weather was perfect for it. Crisp, cool air during the day and cold enough at night to make the campfire feel worth it. I packed light, threw my gear in the back of my truck, and hit the road early Friday morning. The trail was quiet. I barely saw anyone on the way out. A couple of older guys with fishing rods heading back toward the parking lot. A couple walking a dog. After that, nothing. Just me and the woods. The hike took about 2 hours, and by the time I made it to the campsite, the sun was already hanging low. I set up my tent in the clearing, collected some firewood, and got things going. Felt good to be out there. The kind of calm that makes you forget about everything else. I made some food, sat back against a log, and watched the sky turn from gold to deep blue. The first strange thing happened just after sunset. I was sitting by the fire, poking at the logs with a stick when I noticed it. The woods had gone completely quiet. Not just kind of quiet, dead quiet. No birds, no wind, no rustling in the leaves. Just the crackling of the fire and my own breathing. I figured it was nothing. Sometimes the woods just get like that. I've heard it happens when a predator is nearby, so I kept my eyes open. But it was probably just a fox or something. Nothing big. I brushed it off, threw another log on the fire, and kept eating. But that feeling, that heavy, sinking feeling in my gut, it was there. I told myself it was just the quiet getting to me. When you spend enough time alone, your brain starts to mess with you. You start hearing things that aren't there, feeling like you're being watched even when you're not. I dealt with that before, but then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, heavy, not on the trail but in the trees. I stopped moving, just sat there holding my breath, listening. They weren't close, maybe 50, 60 yards out, but they weren't far either. And they were steady. Not a deer, not a bear. Bears don't walk like that. They shuffle, they snap branches. This was different. It sounded like a person. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the woods. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I held the light there for a long time, waiting to see something move, but it stayed still, dead still. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a big animal walking slow, but the feeling in my chest, that tight, crawling feeling, it wouldn't go away. I sat back down by the fire but kept the flashlight next to me. Couldn't relax. Every time the fire crackled, I flinched. Every time the wind moved the trees, I tensed up. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something standing there, but there was nothing, just the woods and the dark. Around midnight, I decided to head into the tent. I figured I'd feel better with the zipper closed, even though I knew that wouldn't stop anything. I left the fire burning low and crawled into my sleeping bag, but I couldn't sleep. I just laid there listening. My ears were picking up everything, every little crack, every snap. Most of it was nothing, just the forest settling. But then, maybe an hour later, I heard it again. The footsteps, Closer this time. Slow. Deliberate. Not crashing through the woods like an animal. I sat up in my sleeping bag, holding my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there could probably hear it. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to let them know I was awake. The footsteps moved around the edge of the clearing. Not coming closer, just circling. I could hear the leaves crunching softly under each step. I waited for a voice, waited for someone to call out, but they never did. They just kept walking, slow, steady. I sat there, frozen, not sure what to do. My first thought was to call out, let them know I was there. Maybe it was just another camper who got lost. But something stopped me. My gut told me not to make a sound. Eventually, the footsteps faded. I sat there for what felt like an hour, waiting to hear them again. But it stayed quiet, that heavy, pressing kind of quiet. I finally laid back down, but I didn't sleep. I just stared at the roof of the tent, waiting for the sun. When morning came, I got out of the tent and checked the clearing. The fire had burned down to ash. The air was cold. Everything looked normal. But when I walked to the edge of the trees where I'd heard the footsteps, I saw it. Tracks. Big ones. Definitely not an animal. Deep impressions in the dirt, like someone had been walking back and forth all night. No boots, just bare feet. I packed up fast. Faster than I ever have before. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. But it stayed quiet. I left the campsite in a hurry, practically jogging back to the trail. I didn't stop until I was back at my truck. The whole drive home, I kept thinking about those tracks, about how they circled the clearing, about how they stopped just outside the light of the fire. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I've been camping most of my life. Not the kind of camping where you park a trailer at some crowded lot with picnic tables and bathrooms. I'm talking real camping, deep woods, no cell service, just you and whatever's out there. I always found it peaceful. I liked the silence, liked knowing I could be completely alone. But now I know that being alone is only good until you realize you're not. It was late October when I went out on my last trip. The air had that cold bite, not quite winter but close. The kind that makes your breath hang in the air. I'd taken a few days off work and driven out to a national forest I hadn't been to before, a place far enough from the city that I'd probably have the trails to myself. I parked my truck at the base of a long dirt road and hiked in about 8 miles. No marked trails, no campsites, just woods. It was perfect. The leaves were dry and crisp under my boots, the trees towering high enough to block out most of the sky. I found a spot by a small stream, flat ground with plenty of trees for cover. I set up camp and built a fire as the sun started to dip. That first night felt normal. I cooked dinner, sat by the fire until the stars came out. There was no wind, just the steady trickle of the stream. The woods were quiet, calm. I went to bed early, planning to hike the ridge the next day. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me. It was the feeling you get when something's off, that prickling at the back of your neck. I lay there for a moment, blinking at the dark, trying to figure out what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it, breathing, deep, slow breathing, heavy enough that I could hear it over the sound of the stream. I froze. I've heard animals outside my tent before, raccoons, deer, even bears once or twice. But this wasn't the same. It was too slow, too steady, sounded wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and shined the beam out into the dark. 2 eyes reflected back at me. They were low to the ground, wide set. The light caught them just right, that glowing, glassy shine you see in animals at night. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. It was a dog. At least it looked like a dog. Big, black fur, thick and matted. It stood perfectly still, staring at me from about 15 feet away. His head was low, chest nearly brushing the ground. His ears were flat back. It didn't move. I've seen strays before. I know how they act, cautious, twitchy. This one wasn't like that. It wasn't scared. It wasn't curious. It was just watching. I shouted, trying to scare it off. It didn't even flinch. I threw a rock. Nothing. It stood there for another minute before it slowly backed into the trees. No rush, no panic, like it knew it had time. I stayed up the rest of the night with my knife in my hand, listening. I never heard it leave. The next morning, I looked around camp. No tracks, no fur, nothing. I told myself it was just a stray, maybe a farm dog that wandered too far. It happens. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling it wasn't right. I spent the day hiking the ridge. By late afternoon, I was back at camp. The woods were quiet again, the same calm silence as before. I built the fire bigger that night, not because I was cold, but because I wanted the light. As the sun dropped, I started hearing it again. Footsteps, not running, not crashing through the woods, just slow, steady steps. I stood up, shined my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. I circled the camp, listening. The footsteps kept moving, always staying just out of sight. I kept thinking I'd catch a glimpse of something, but I never did. Felt like a game, like it was circling, watching me panic. Finally, it stopped. The woods went quiet again. I stayed by the fire until my legs ached from standing. When I finally sat down, my hands were shaking. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again. The breathing, the footsteps. Once I thought I heard it growl. Low, deep, the kind of sound that vibrates in your chest. By morning, I was done. I packed up camp, ready to get the hell out of there. I'd hiked about 2 miles when I found the tracks. They were mine. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at the ground. It was a soft patch of dirt, enough to catch footprints. I saw my boot prints heading out, and over them were paw prints, big, heavy, following me step for step. My mouth went dry. I crouched down, running my fingers over the edges of the prints. They were fresh, deep, and they weren't from last night. They were from now. I looked up, heart pounding. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I could feel it watching me again, that prickling at the back of my neck. I started walking faster, then jogging. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see it break through the trees. But it didn't. It stayed just out of sight. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was dipping low again. I could see my truck through the trees. I was almost there. That's when I heard it. The breathing, right behind me. Slow, deep, calm. I whipped around, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. I scanned the trees, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. Nothing. I backed up slowly, step by step, until I hit the door of my truck. I fumbled with the keys, throwing my pack in the back and climbing inside. I locked the doors, heart racing. As I backed out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. It was standing in the road. Same dog, same eyes. It just stood there watching me drive away. I haven't been camping since. I still hike sometimes, but I don't go deep anymore. I stick to the trails where there are people around. But sometimes when I'm out there, when the woods get quiet, I swear I hear it again. The breathing, the footsteps, always just far enough away that I can't see it. Always watching. I've always liked being alone. Maybe it's the quiet or the space to think, but I've never minded having no one else around. That's why I go camping solo. Clears my head, or at least it used to. Last year, I drove up to a state forest I'd never been to before. I'd heard about it from a friend who said it was remote, quiet, exactly what I wanted. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, a bit of food, and my knife. I didn't bring my phone. I never do. Out there, there's no point, no service, and besides, I liked disconnecting for a few days. The drive took me about 3 hours. It was one of those long, winding roads where the trees on either side start to look the same. By the time I parked at the trailhead, the sun was already starting to drop behind the trees. I figured I had about 2 hours of light left. I hiked in about 5 miles, deep enough that I knew I wouldn't see anyone else. That was the point. I found a good spot, flat ground with a clearing big enough for my tent, and a small creek about 50 yards away for water. The air was cool, a little damp, It had rained a few days before. You could still smell it. By the time I set up my tent and got the fire going, it was dark. I sat by the flames, ate a quick dinner, and stared up at the stars. The woods were quiet, just the sound of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves. I wasn't thinking about much, just sitting there, breathing it in. But then I noticed something. No wind, no bugs. The woods felt heavy, like something had sucked all the sound out of the air. I figured it was just the weather, maybe the temperature dropping, but it made me uneasy. I stayed up for a while longer, throwing a few more logs on the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I finally crawled into my tent, it was almost midnight. I left the fire burning low, not enough to keep me awake, but enough that I could still see the glow through the fabric. I zipped the tent closed, pulled my bag up to my chest, and closed my eyes. I woke up about 2 hours later. Something had snapped. A branch, maybe. It was loud enough to jolt me awake, and I froze. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. The woods were silent again. Too silent. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Moving through the trees, just outside my camp. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a bear, but the footsteps didn't sound right. They weren't the quick, clumsy steps of an animal. They were deliberate. One step, pause. Another step, pause. Like someone was walking slowly. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. I stayed in my bag, barely breathing. The footsteps circled my tent once, then twice. I could hear them moving through the leaves, crunching softly. They were close enough that I could almost feel it. I wanted to say something, to shout, to scare them off, but my throat felt tight. I just lay there, holding the knife, listening. After a while, the footsteps stopped. I stayed awake until the sun came up. When I finally got the nerve to step outside, the fire was out. I could see where I left the logs, but they were scattered, almost like someone had kicked them. I looked around the campsite. Nothing else was touched, but there were footprints, bare feet. They were small, narrow, the kind you'd expect from a woman or a kid. They circled my tent, wandered over to the fire pit, then stopped about 10 feet away, like whoever it was had just been standing there, watching. I packed my gear in a hurry. I told myself it was probably a hiker, maybe someone messing with me, but the nearest trail was miles away. Nobody hikes barefoot. I hiked about 3 miles out before I started to calm down. The woods felt normal again. Birds, wind in the trees, the kind of sounds you don't notice until they're gone. I stopped to catch my breath and get some water. That's when I saw it. Another footprint, bare feet, fresh. They were facing the trail, pointed right at me. My chest tightened. I scanned the woods, my pulse pounding in my ears. Nobody, just trees. I grabbed my pack and started walking again. I didn't stop until I reached the next clearing. I set up camp again because I didn't know what else to do. It was getting dark, and I didn't want to be walking the trails at night. I built another fire, bigger this time, and sat by it with my knife in my lap. The woods felt heavier than before. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, not walking this time, running, fast. They came from deep in the woods, crashing through the trees. I shot up, heart pounding, knife in hand. The fire crackled, but I could barely hear it over the sound of footsteps. Getting louder, closer. Then they stopped, dead silent. I shined my flashlight through the trees, my breath shaking. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there, just trees. Then I noticed the fire. The logs were scattered again, like something had kicked them. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack, left my tent behind, and started hiking. I didn't care about the dark. I didn't care about getting lost. I just needed to be out of those woods. I hiked until the sun came up. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was soaked in sweat, shaking so bad I could barely unlock my truck. I've been camping since I was a kid. I know what animals sound like. I know what people sound like. I still don't know what that was. And the worst part? A few weeks later, I found something tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. A small, dirty footprint. I haven't camped since. I've spent most of my life in the woods. I've camped alone more times than I can count, and I've never been the type to scare easy. When you grow up hiking and camping, you learn that most of the time, the scariest thing out there is you. Animals keep their distance. People rarely wander that far out. As long as you respect the woods, they leave you alone. Or at least that's what I thought. Last fall, I took a trip up to the national forest about 3 hours from home. I wanted a few days to myself, no service, no distractions, just the quiet. I packed light like I always do. A small tent, some food, water, and my knife. The forecast said it'd be cold at night, but I didn't mind. I camped in worse. I parked my truck at the trailhead and hiked about 6 miles in. I know these woods pretty well, and I had a spot in mind near a small river with flat ground and plenty of trees for cover. It's a place I'd camped before, out of the way, no trails nearby. I never see anyone out there. I got to camp around mid-afternoon. The air was cool, crisp. The leaves were starting to turn, that deep orange and red that always makes the woods feel quieter. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and made a fire. Everything felt normal, calm. It wasn't until the sun started going down that I noticed the first strange thing. I was sitting by the fire, cooking dinner, when I heard something moving through the trees. Not a squirrel or a bird, something bigger. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but the sound was off. Slow, heavy, footsteps. They stopped and started, like something was watching me, moving when I wasn't looking. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing. I sat there for a while, listening. After a few minutes, I heard the sound again, closer this time. I stood up, heart pounding a little harder now. I walked toward the edge of the clearing, shined my light through the trees. That's when I saw it. A dog. At least I thought it was a dog. It was standing about 30 feet away, just far enough that I couldn't see it clearly. Big, black fur, matted and thick. Its head was low, ears back. I could just barely make out its eyes, reflecting the light, watching me. It didn't move. I stood there for a long time, holding the light on it. I wasn't scared, not yet. I figured it was a stray or maybe a farm dog that wandered too far from home. I shouted to scare it off, but it didn't flinch. It just kept staring. After a minute, I backed away. I threw a few more logs on the fire, made it bigger. Most animals don't want anything to do with people. I figured it would lose interest and move on, but it didn't. It stayed there. I could just barely see its shape in the dark, sitting at the edge of the trees, watching. I went to bed a few hours later, but I kept the fire burning low. I didn't like the idea of something hanging around camp while I was sleeping. I lay in my tent for a long time, listening. Every now and then, I'd hear movement. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves. Once or twice, I heard breathing. Low, heavy. I didn't sleep much. In the morning, I walked to the spot where I'd seen it. The ground was soft from the rain a few days before, and I found tracks. Big ones. Way too big for a normal dog. They were deep, too heavy. I crouched down, ran my fingers over the edges. It had been standing there for a long time. I decided to stay another night. I don't know why. Maybe part of me didn't want to admit I was spooked. I spent most of the day hiking, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. I kept hearing something in the distance, the same slow, heavy footsteps. I'd stop and it would stop. I'd walk and it would start again. I never saw it. Not during the day. That night, I built the fire bigger. I sat by it with my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again, the sound of breathing. Slow, steady. It was standing at the edge of the clearing again. This time, it was closer. I could see it better now. Its fur was darker than the night, thick and dirty. Its legs were long, almost too long. Its head was low to the ground, like it was ready to lunge. But what got me most were the eyes. They didn't look like a dog's. They were too wide, too focused. Not curious, not afraid, just staring. I yelled again, threw a rock. It didn't move. I could see its chest rising and falling, calm. That's when I started to feel it. This heavy, sinking feeling in my chest. Like I was prey, like it was waiting for something. I backed up toward the fire, keeping my eyes on it. It followed me with its gaze, but it didn't move. Just sat there, calm and still. I don't know how long we stayed like that. At some point, I realized I was shaking. I grabbed my pack, threw some water on the fire, and backed away down the trail. I kept my flashlight pointed at it until I couldn't see it anymore. I hiked through the night. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see it following me. A few times I thought I heard it, the snap of a branch, the sound of breathing, but I never saw it again. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was just starting to rise. I threw my pack in the back and sat there for a minute, catching my breath. My hands were still shaking. As I backed out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. It was standing at the edge of the trees. Same place, same eyes. I haven't been back since. And the worst part? Sometimes when I'm walking home at night, I swear I hear it again. Slow footsteps, heavy breathing, always just far enough away that I can't see it. Always watching. I've always been comfortable in the woods. Some people find it eerie, the quiet, the isolation, but that's why I like it. No cars, no voices, no distractions. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the crunch of dirt under your boots. I've been camping since I was a kid, and over the years I got used to spending a few days out there alone. Clears my head, or at least it used to. The trip last summer changed all that. I planned it like I always do, 4 days solo. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, about 10 miles from the nearest trailhead. I'd been there once before, years back, and I remembered how quiet it was. No campsites, no other hikers. Just trees and a small creek running through the valley. Perfect. I got there in the early afternoon, parked my truck at the trailhead, and hiked in. The pack was heavy, but I liked that. I liked feeling the weight of it, the slow rhythm of walking for hours. It was warm that day, high 70s, but the air felt heavy, humid. By the time I reached the spot I'd picked out, a clearing just off the creek, I was sweating through my shirt. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and got the fire going before the sun started to set. Felt good to be out there. I sat by the fire for a while, cooking dinner and listening to the water running over the rocks. The woods were quiet, but not in a bad way, just calm. I stayed up until the stars came out, then crawled into my tent and fell asleep fast. The first strange thing happened the next morning. I woke up early, just after sunrise. I unzipped the tent, stretched, and walked over to the fire pit. I'd put the fire out the night before, buried it under dirt until it was cold. But when I got there, the rocks had been moved. They were still in a circle, but not how I left them, stacked neatly into a small pile. At first, I thought maybe I'd done it. Maybe I was half asleep and didn't remember. But the longer I stared at it, the more it made my skin crawl. Something about how neatly the rocks were stacked, almost careful. I knelt down and ran my hand over the dirt. It was cold. Nobody had restarted the fire, just the rocks. I tried to brush it off. Maybe an animal did it, a raccoon or something. I kicked the pile over, made breakfast, and tried not to think about it. But the feeling stuck with me. I spent most of that day hiking. There was a ridge about 2 miles from camp I wanted to check out. It was steep on the way up, and by the time I got to the top, my legs were burning. The view was worth it, though, trees in every direction, stretching out until they blurred into the mountains. I sat there for a while, drinking water and catching my breath. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anyone, just the wind moving through the trees. I started heading back in the late afternoon. The whole way down, something felt off. I kept stopping to listen, thinking I'd heard something. Footsteps, maybe, but there was nothing, just the sound of my breathing and the wind in the trees. When I got back to camp, the first thing I noticed was the tent. The zipper was open. I stopped a few feet away, my heart pounding. I was sure I'd zipped it before I left. I always zip it. I walked closer, slowly, and crouched down to look inside. Nothing was missing. My sleeping bag was still there, my gear untouched. But the feeling wouldn't go away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent for hours, staring at the ceiling. Every little noise made my skin crawl. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. At some point, I started to hear it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the edge of my camp. I held my breath, listening. They'd stop, then start again, crunching softly through the dirt. I wanted to look. I wanted to unzip the tent and shine my light out there, but I couldn't make myself do it. I just lay there, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The footsteps circled the camp twice, then stopped. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, there were footprints, bare feet. They were small, narrow, the kind you'd expect from a woman. They circled my tent, wandered over to the fire pit, then stopped at the creek. I crouched down, touching one of them. The dirt was still damp, fresh. My stomach dropped. I packed my gear as fast as I could. I kept telling myself it was a hiker, someone messing with me. But why wouldn't they say anything? Why walk around my tent in the middle of the night? I decided to hike out. I wasn't supposed to leave until the next day, but I didn't care. I wanted to be out of those woods. I threw my pack on, checked my map, and started back toward the trailhead. A few miles in, I started to feel it again. That heaviness, like I wasn't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I didn't see anything, just trees. Then I saw her. She was standing about 50 yards off the trail, half hidden behind the trees. I could barely make her out. Dark hair, pale skin. She wasn't moving, just standing there, facing me. My legs felt like concrete. I stared at her for a long time, my heart pounding in my ears. Then I took a step back. She didn't move. I turned and started walking faster. I didn't run, something about it felt wrong. Like if I ran, she'd run too. I kept looking back, but every time I did, she was closer. Still not moving, just standing there. By the time I reached the last mile, I was shaking. The woods were getting darker, the trees closing in. I could hear something behind me, the sound of branches snapping, the crunch of leaves. Slow, steady. I didn't look back again. I just kept walking until I saw the parking lot. When I got to my truck, I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors. I sat there for a second, catching my breath, and then I turned on the headlights. She was there, standing at the edge of the trees, her face just barely visible in the shadows. She didn't move. I didn't wait to see what she'd do next. I started the truck and drove. I didn't stop until I was 2 towns away. I don't camp alone anymore. And the worst part? Sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I see her again, standing on the side of the road, always watching. I've been camping my whole life. My dad took me out to the woods before I could even walk, and by the time I was old enough to carry my own pack, I was doing weekend trips solo. I know the woods. I know how they sound, how they move, how they change when something's wrong. I've never been the kind of person to scare easy, but this was different. It was late September when I decided to head out to Black Ridge. There's a stretch of forest there, dense pine and spruce that hardly anyone hikes through. It's a place where the trail is more of a suggestion than a path. You go out far enough and you don't hear anything but the trees. No traffic, no planes, no voices, just the woods. That's why I liked it. I left early in the morning, parked my truck at the end of an old logging road, and hiked about 6 miles in. The weather was perfect, cool enough to need a jacket, but not cold enough to bite. The kind of air that smells damp and clean. I carried enough gear to last a few nights. I wasn't in a rush. I just wanted to be out there. The spot I picked was a clearing near a small lake. The water was dark and still, reflecting the trees so perfectly it looked like glass. I set up my tent just off the shore, gathered wood, and built a fire before the sun started to dip. Everything felt normal, peaceful. But then the woods got quiet. If you've spent enough time outside, you know what I mean. There's always noise, insects, birds, wind moving through the trees. But that evening, it all just stopped, like someone had hit a mute button. I sat by the fire, listening. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe there was a predator nearby, a coyote or a bobcat, but it didn't feel right. I kept looking up. I didn't know why at first, but I kept finding myself staring at the tops of the trees. Something about the way the branches moved seemed off, like something was shifting up there. I didn't see anything, though. I kept the fire going until late, then crawled into my tent. I wasn't asleep long before I heard it. A screech, high-pitched and sharp. Not like an owl or a hawk. It was deeper, rougher. Sounded wrong, like it was too big for any bird I'd ever heard. I sat up fast, heart pounding. Came again, this time from the trees near the water. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The night was still. The moon hung low, lighting up the clearing just enough to see my breath in the air. I scanned the trees with my flashlight. The beam caught the branches, the trunks, the water. Nothing. And then I heard the wings. It wasn't the flapping of a small bird. It was heavy, powerful, like something big was moving just above the trees. I turned off the flashlight and just listened, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. The wings beat slow, steady, and then stopped. Something landed in the trees. The branches creaked under the weight of it. I still couldn't see it, it was too high up, but I could feel it. My whole body tensed. It was the kind of fear you don't think about. It just happens. My legs felt weak, my breath shallow. I crouched by the fire, trying to keep my movements quiet. And then it moved again. The sound of claws scraping bark. Slow, deliberate, like it was climbing down. I aimed the flashlight at the trees and caught a glimpse of something. Just for a second. Feathers. Dark, rough, matted with something that looked like mud or blood. I didn't get a good look. I wish I hadn't seen it at all. Screeched again, louder this time. Close. Too close. My chest felt like it was going to cave in. I backed toward the tent, grabbed my knife, but I didn't know what I was going to do with it. What do you do against something like that? And then it took off. The wind from its wings hit me hard enough to stir the fire. Sparks shot into the air, and I ducked, covering my head. I heard it fly, slow, heavy wing beats that echoed through the trees. It circled once, then disappeared. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the fire burning until the sun came up, sitting there with my back to the tent, knife in my hand. I kept telling myself I imagined it, that it was just a big bird, an eagle or something. But I knew better. I've seen eagles. They don't move like that. They don't sound like that. The next morning, I checked the trees where I saw it land. The bark was ripped deep, like something heavy had sunk its claws in. There were feathers too thick, dark feathers the size of my hand. I picked one up and immediately dropped it. It smelled like rot, like something dead. I packed my gear and left, fast. I didn't stop until I was halfway back to the truck. The whole way, I kept hearing things. Branches snapping, the sound of wings somewhere high above the trees. I never saw it again, but I knew it was there. I could feel it. By the time I got to the truck, the sky was starting to cloud over. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a while, just breathing. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely start the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a second, just a second, I thought I saw something in the trees. Something big, perched high on a branch, watching. But when I blinked, it was gone. I don't know what it was. I don't care. I haven't been back to Black Ridge since. And I don't think I ever will.